All right. Hello, everybody. Great pleasure for me to present to you today. Methane is the topic, and actually, it is a hot topic. You might know that there is a lot going on the regional, on the national, on the international stage with respect to the impact that societies have on climate, but not just society in general, but there is some focus certainly on fossil fuels and all those fossil fuel industries, but also a lot of focus on agriculture, and here in particular on ruminant agriculture, because cattle produce methane. And that methane comes out the front end. A process called enteric fermentation is what's behind it. These animals belch that methane out. And some of it is also released from the animal's manure. Some people say that cattle are one of the driving forces of climate change. And I think it is the time now to rethink methane, because methane is very different from other greenhouse gases. And I believe that a lot of the blame that's currently placed on livestock is unwarranted. My name is Frank Mitloehner, and I've been here in Davis since 2002. I'm a professor and air quality specialist in the Department of Animal Science. I'm specialized in the impact of livestock on the environment, and particularly impacts on climate, on air quality, and so forth. I'm also the director of the CLEAR Center here at UC Davis, a center that does two things. It does research and communication around sustainability in animal agriculture. I'm probably one of the very few faculty members in this country who has journalists hired on staff in order to help me communicate with an interested public, with policymakers, and so forth. So again, that's the CLEAR Center that you see mentioned on my slides at the bottom right. I'm on Twitter. My handle is GHGGuru, and if you're not on Twitter, I encourage you to be there. And once you are, please follow me and follow us at the CLEAR Center as well. If what I'm about to say interests you further and you need a refresher, or you just want to share it with others, we put together a YouTube video called Rethinking Methane, and you see it here. I'm not playing it, but I'm just showing you the first slide. Rethinking Methane is a video that in a very succinct way, in 5 minutes, describes one of the most important aspects that I think we are facing in animal agriculture right now, and that is what the true contribution of livestock is to a changing climate. And here, methane is the centerpiece. I will now give you a little 101 on climate and greenhouse gases. What you see on this slide is the sun radiating down solar beams to the surface of the Earth, and with it, of course, radiant heat. Normally, that solar radiation would be reflected back into space if there weren't these gases, these so-called greenhouse gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and others. And these gases effectively form let's call it a blanket over our atmosphere, okay? Just like putting a blanket over your body on a cool summer evening that keeps you warm, and it keeps you warm because it's retaining your body heat close to your body. So do these greenhouse gases. This blanket is trapping the heat from the sun and makes it stay in our atmosphere. In fact, without these greenhouse gases, life on Earth would be way too cold. So we need greenhouse gases. The problem is we're producing too many of them, and that's causing this blanket to become too thick. And this is what warms up our planet. So the question now is, which human activities generate these greenhouse gases? Which ones are the most important activities? Which ones are the most important gases? And are there differences across these gases? Most climate scientists will tell you that the #1 human activity causing a changing climate is the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels being oil, coal, gas. And when you do that, when you do burn these fossil fuels, you produce CO2, carbon dioxide. Our special friends, and I mean those that don't really like us very much in animal agriculture, they say, no, it's methane that's the main culprit, and we need to get rid of our livestock, particularly of our bovines. Hence, I will concentrate on methane for this talk. Nitrous oxide is another gas, and I will mention that as well. So here you see the three gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. When people compare these gases to one another, they oftentimes, or most times, use a unit called the global warming potential, GWP 100. Before I talk about that, let's just give you an analogy. Okay, let's say we go drink. Okay, one of us drinks beer, one of us drinks wine, and one of us drinks vodka. Same volume. Okay, same volume. We all know that we would get a buzz at different rates. Why? Because they have different concentrations of alcohol in them. We just have a unit comparing that, the percent alcohol in those beverages. For the atmosphere and for the warming, there is also a unit. That unit is referred to as global warming potential. It describes the potency, not to get a buzz, but the potency of trapping heat from the sun. Global warming potential 100, GWP 100. This unit has been used since 1990. And people felt that this was a correct, scientifically sound method to use. Recently, there has been serious doubt about that. So what does this unit say? This unit compares gases such as methane and nitrous oxide to carbon dioxide. So it says that methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. And it says that nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent than CO2. In other words, methane and nitrous oxide are really potent greenhouse gases, okay? So if, let's say, a dairy were to produce 10 tons of methane from cows' manure, 10 tons of methane, then all you need to do is multiply the 10 tons, so 10 times this factor there, 28, 10 times 28, that's 280 tons of CO2 equivalent or CO2e gases. So this global warming potential 100, GWP 100, allows you to compare a source of methane or a source of nitrous oxide to a certain amount of CO2 equivalent, CO2e gases, okay? So that sounds really simple, and that's why it was developed, to simplify things, to compare, let's say, a car to a cow, or a cow to a car, by saying, a cow produces so and so many pounds of methane per year, a car produces so and so many pounds of CO2 per year. How does the one compare to the other? Okay, so that's why that was developed, this global warming potential. So I will now concentrate my presentation on methane and describe to you why the use of this unit is not appropriate for methane. I will start with the so-called global methane budget. So there are many different sources for methane, including fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and so on. All these different sources produce a total amount of around 560 teragrams of methane per year. 560 teragrams of methane per year are produced. That means there are sources for 560 teragrams. But while this is what is reported in the media, it is a very misleading narrative, because methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. On the right side, you see that there are total sinks amounting to 550 teragrams. So sources on the left, 560, and sinks on the right, 550 teragrams, meaning you now need to subtract the one from the other if you want to have the net. And the net then becomes 10. 10 teragrams is still a number that we seek to further reduce, but certainly one that's very different from the 560 that we frequently see reported. So what is it that generates a sink for methane? If you look at this large arrow pointing downward, you see underneath sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. What does that mean? That means that a methane molecule that's in the atmosphere, that is emitted, let's say, by a cow, sooner or later, generally within 10 years, within a decade, meets another molecule in the atmosphere, which is called a radical. To be precise, it's called a hydroxyl radical. And this radical steals a portion from the methane, from the CH4, namely the hydrogen. It steals the hydrogen from the methane and destroys it. Okay? And this happens within a decade. Within a decade, methane meets its enemy and is destroyed. Why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because this is really important to understand its impact on climate. And I will explain that in some detail now. So remember on this slide, methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. In other words, there is a natural atmospheric removal going on for methane. An atmospheric removal going on for methane, and that's not the case for CO2 and for nitrous oxide. But it is true for methane, an atmospheric removal. So any accounting for methane should not just include the production of that gas by, let's say, a cow, but it should also account for its atmospheric removal. I think that should be pretty clear. Why? Because this atmospheric removal determines how long this gas or how long a gas is in the air. CO2, for example, once it's emitted by, let's say, us driving a car, stays in the air for 1,000 years. So when you drove to work today, from home to work, you burn gas, you produce CO2, that CO2 will be in the air for 1,000 years. If you are a farmer, you put fertilizer on the fields, that some of that nitrogen in the fertilizer will be converted into nitrous oxide, and that also stays in the atmosphere for a long time. Both CO2 and nitrous oxide are referred to as long-lived climate pollutants. Long-lived climate pollutants. Methane is not a long-lived climate pollutant, but it is a short-lived climate pollutant with a lifespan of approximately 1 decade. Okay, so that's the next take-home message. Methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. After 10 years, it's destroyed. And that is a very important nuance in this discussion. I'll now explain to you how greenhouse gases from animal agriculture, particularly methane, is really different from greenhouse gases that are generated from other sources, let's say from fossil fuel. Why? Well, when it comes to methane, we have to ask ourselves, where does the carbon in the methane, in the biogenic methane, where does that carbon come from and where is it going? It all starts with photosynthesis, a process that we know our plants do, by which they need sunlight and water and a form of carbon to grow. The form of carbon these plants need, comes from the atmosphere in the form of CO2, carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide makes its way into the plant, and the plant then converts that carbon into carbohydrates. Carbohydrates such as starch or cellulose. By the way, cellulose is the world's most abundant biomass. Cellulose in grasses, the world's most abundant biomass. And the only animals that can make use of that and convert that cellulose into animal source foods for human consumption are ruminants. They're the only ones who can digest cellulose and make volatile fatty acids from it, and then eventually milk and meat and so forth. Okay, only ruminants can do that. However, the problem is that there's an unintended consequence. The microbes converting the cellulose, the starch, and so on into volatile fatty acids and eventually into animal source foods, those microbes produce methane. That methane is belched out, and that's the #1 source of methane from ruminant livestock, the belching. And the #2 is the animal manure. So that methane now comes out and constitutes a portion of the carbohydrates that were in the plant material. So that methane comes out. Is this carbon in the methane, is that new carbon added to the atmosphere? Is it additional carbon added to the atmosphere? The answer is no, it's not. It's recycled carbon because it originated in the form of atmospheric CO2. So the methane carbon originally was CO2 carbon, but it was already in the atmosphere, okay? If we consider a constant cattle herd in a region, and in the United States, cattle herds haven't increased in ages, but they have been either constant or declining. If you have a constant cattle herd, then the amount of methane produced by those animals and the amount of methane that is destroyed through oxidation, and I talked about this before, are in balance. Production and destruction in balance, okay? And that means after about a decade, that methane is destroyed, process called hydroxyl oxidation, that methane is destroyed and converted back into CO2. Now you'll ask me probably, well, why is that a good thing? Didn't you just say that methane has a short lifespan and CO2 a long one? It's not a question about good or bad. The question here is, where does the carbon come from that ends up being methane? Is it new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere, or is it not new? And the answer is it's not new, it's recycled. The biogenic carbon cycle is a cycle by which carbon makes it from the atmosphere into plants and back into the atmosphere, into plants. And of course, atmosphere, plants, animals, atmosphere, plant, animals. It's going around and around and around. This process does not add new additional carbon to the atmosphere unless you increase herd size. And there are parts of the world where we do that. Okay, so for example, in many developing countries, the demand for animal source food is increasing and is met by growing livestock herds. And when you do that, then when you grow, let's say cattle herds, then you add new additional methane to the atmosphere that wasn't there previously. So remember here on this slide, the biogenic carbon cycle is one where carbon is cyclical and where carbon is not created new, but cycling around a pretty closed system. Is this similar or different from other major greenhouse gas processes? It's actually very different from, let's say, fossil fuels. What are fossil fuels? Fossil fuels are, well, they used to be forests, they used to be dinosaurs and so on, and they accumulated over a long, long time span. These animals and plants, they died and decayed and they fossilized and accumulated in the ground. And over the last 70 years, 70 that is, humans have extracted approximately half of all that fossil fuel from the ground where it was for so long. And what do we do with it? We burned it. We burned it with cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, power plants, and so on, taking that carbon that was in the ground for so long and putting it straight into the atmosphere. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the main culprit of human contributions to a changing climate, the use of fossil fuels. I know very few climate scientists who would doubt what I just said, that fossil fuels are by far the most important contribution to a changing climate. But there are now policymakers and there are anti-livestock people and so on who say, no, we should focus on methane because it's so potent. And it's true, methane is potent, but as you can see in a minute, it matters as to what the fate of that methane is. Before I talk more about methane in particular, just a quick comparison side by side between carbon on the fossil fuel side versus carbon on the biogenic side. On the fossil fuel side, you drill or dig carbon out of the ground. That's fossil fuels. You unlock them, you burn them, and you add this ancient carbon to the atmosphere. And this is why CO2 concentrations globally go up and up and up and up year after year after year. They don't go down, they only go up. Okay. Now, on the livestock side, we have CO2 in the atmosphere that during photosynthesis makes it into plants. Some of that CO2 stays in the above ground. A lot of it goes into the below ground part of the vegetation, into roots, from the roots into the surrounding soil, a process called soil carbon sequestration. Approximately 1/3 of all human-caused carbon, 1/3, is stored in soils. Soils are extremely important in the carbon picture. And farmers and foresters are the only two sectors that can really enhance soil carbon sequestration. And guess what makes soil carbon sequestration really go through the roof? It is livestock grazing on this land, depositing manure, and therefore nutrients that are important for those soil microbes to really ramp up and be super active, and taking carbon and pulling it into the ground and keeping it there. So some of that above ground material, above ground vegetation, is then eaten by our, let's say, bovines. Some of it is belched out in the form of methane. Some of it comes from the manure. But again, the point is after 10 years, that methane is converted back into CO2 and water. So here you have that cycle on the right side. And on the left side, you have a one-way street. That is why nobody should really compare cars to cows. And they know it, but they do it anyhow. So I will now go into some technical aspects of methane and how methane is different from CO2. And I hope that it makes sense, and that you will understand why we are resetting the narrative around livestock and climate by what I'm about to tell you here. So I start with CO2. Imagine going to work on Monday, okay? So you're driving your car from home to work, you burn gas, and as a result, you put CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's day one. On day two, let's say Tuesday, you drive the same distance again, and now you add new additional CO2 to what's still there from yesterday. On Wednesday, you do the same thing, and you add new additional CO2 in addition to what's still in from Tuesday and from Monday, and so on. You get the gist of it. Every time you burn gas, you add new additional CO2 to the existing stock that you put in earlier this week, earlier this month, earlier this year, this decade, earlier throughout your life, the lives of your parents and grandparents. This stuff stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. As a result of adding CO2 that you put out today to the existing stock, this is called a stock gas. Okay, CO2 is called a stock gas. It accumulates in the atmosphere. Okay, it accumulates in the atmosphere. Please remember that. That's why those numbers go up and up and up over time. Methane is treated by our policymakers as if it were to do the same thing, as if every day a cow belches, that were to be added on to what was belched out last year and the year before and so on. But is that accurate? Is methane a stock gas? And the answer is no, it's not. I told you before about atmospheric removal of methane. Methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And that makes methane a flow gas. So let's say you were to have a dairy and you started that 50 years ago. Then only during the first 10 years, you added new additional methane to the atmosphere. After the first 10 years, the amount of methane produced by your cows and the amount of methane removed through oxidation were in balance. No additional warming, no new additional warming. For those of you who feel that this is a little too abstract, let me give you an analogy, okay? A bathtub analogy, actually. I will start with the CO2 analogy first. Imagine a bathtub that has only a faucet, but no drain. Regardless of how you turn that faucet on, whether you turn it on low or on high, the level of water in your bathtub will always go up. It can only go up because you have no drain, okay? That's what happens to CO2. Regardless of how much CO2 we produce, how much fossil fuel we burn, and therefore CO2 we produce, the concentrations of CO2 are going up year after year after year, and with it, the related warming. That's what we are battling right now. Now let's look at the methane bathtub analogy. Here, you have a faucet, but you have a drain as well. That's the atmospheric removal. So when you turn on the faucet, let's say halfway, then the amount of water you put into that bathtub and the amount of water that's draining out the drain are in balance. And as a result, the water level stays stable. If you crank the faucet on all the way, then you will add more water than the drain can let go of. And that is actually what's happening in the developing world, okay, where livestock herds are growing. As a result, methane goes up, okay, and that leads to additional warming. We don't want to see that. But if, going back to the bathtub, if the water is turned down and the drain stays at the normal opening range, then you will actually have water levels going down. And that's what happens with methane. It happens with methane in all those regions where we can reduce methane. When we reduce methane, then the levels of warming can go down. Now think about that. Methane is actually a key to our climate puzzle, because if we manage to reduce it, we see an instantaneous reduction. So remember on this slide, CO2 is a stock gas, nitrous oxide is also a stock gas, but methane is a flow gas. Methane does not accumulate in the atmosphere. When emissions of methane stays stable, then the concentration in the atmosphere of methane stays stable, and then the warming around this methane stays stable. No additional warming, okay? The first one who brought this to the forefront of our attention was Professor Miles Allen. You see his name mentioned here at the bottom, from Oxford University and his team. And he said, well, what we are currently doing with methane is just not right. It's not fair. Methane is not a stock gas. It doesn't accumulate. But this GWP100 that I talked about before acts as if methane were a stock gas and as if it were to accumulate. And that's not true. So he said, we have to change that. And Miles Allen is not just someone, he is one of the senior contributors of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. So he and colleagues wrote a bunch of white papers and blogs and so on, some of which are mentioned here. Of course, also numerous peer-reviewed publications, one of them on the right. That caused a lot of interest, okay, a lot of interest. He discussed this concept that we are talking about in the next couple of slides at the IPCC. It was picked up by people like myself and so forth. And because what they did was, what Miles Allen and colleagues did was, they said, the GWP100, the unit that we used in the past, or until now really, to quantify the impact of methane, is inappropriate. And he proposed an alternative unit called GWP star. Because GWP star actually looks into what methane does to climate. Not just what methane does to CO2e, CO2 equivalent units, but what methane does to climate. And it takes into consideration the actual atmosphere removal that occurs around methane. I will now walk you through 3 scenarios around methane. I will show you how they are depicted using GWP100 and then GWP star. So there are 3 scenarios here. Over 30 years, the first scenario is an increase of methane over 35%. The second one is methane being pretty stable, maybe a slight reduction over 30 years by 10%. And the third scenario is one where we reduce methane over 30 years by 35%. So that's a strong reduction. So let's now see how this strong increase, the stable, and the decreasing methane scenarios are depicted using this GWP100. GWP100 predicts that all 3 scenarios, the increasing, stable, and decreasing scenario, add a significant amount of additional CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases to our atmosphere. It predicts that all 3 scenarios add significant additional warming to our climate. And it shows that GWP100 clearly does not take atmospheric removals into consideration, because it's impossible that a stable amount of methane or slightly falling amount of methane would lead to a strong increase in CO2 equivalent units. Remember that bathtub analogy. This means you have your faucet on normal and your drain is open, and that means that you have no increase in water level, but you have a stable water level, okay? A stable water level, no additional rise in water levels. So here we should see no additional CO2 equivalent units under stable conditions, and under decreasing conditions, we should see the analogy of turning down the faucet and leaving that drain open. So we should now see falling methane. So this is really showing you that GWP100 does not predict appropriately and accurately what methane does under stable and under decreasing conditions. Hence the need for the unit GWP star, this Oxford unit, which also predicts that under increasing amounts of methane, the warming goes up pretty drastically, because there's no doubt methane is a potent greenhouse gas. But look what happens when methane stays stable or is slightly reduced. Then you don't see any blue north of the x-axis, meaning no additional positive warming, but a little bit of blue south of the x-axis, meaning a little bit of negative warming. And you see the sign in front of the number has turned from positive to negative.
Negative warming, what does that mean? Negative warming means cooling. So if you slightly reduce methane, you have a slight cooling effect. If you strongly reduce methane by 35% or so, then you have a lot of carbon pulled out of the atmosphere. Similarly to planting a forest, let's say, where trees suck CO2 out of the air, net removing carbon from the atmosphere, which leads to cooling. The same thing happens with methane, and it happens instantaneously. If you reduce methane, you get an instantaneous decrease in warming. If you increase methane, you get an instantaneous warming of the climate, okay? So that's how important it is for us to get that methane picture right. We don't want to increase it, but we do want to decrease it. So later I will get to the question which you might have, which is it possible for us to achieve something like this, a strong reduction of 35% or so? Because indeed, there are now some regions, and California is one of them, where these reduction goals have made it into law. Before I get to that, I will show you three more scenarios for both CO2 and methane, okay? So let's imagine a power plant that over 30 years or so ramps up its load because there's increasing demand of power. So this power plant over 30 years would then produce more CO2 over time, and the warming related to that increasing CO2 would lead to an exponential increase. So exponential increase of warming when we increase CO2. When we linearly increase methane, let's say from a feedlot that grows from 10,000 to 15,000 cattle over a certain period of time, then we see a linear and corresponding increase of that warming related with that methane, okay? So increase of methane leads to an increase of warming. Now the next question is, what happens when we have a constant emissions of CO2? When our power plant does not increase load over time, but has constant load of production over time, that would lead to constant amounts of CO2 emissions from that power plant. But if you look at the warming here at the bottom, you see that the constant amount of CO2 leads to an increasing amount of warming. Why? Because it's cumulative. It accumulates in the atmosphere. What I produce today is an addition to what I produced yesterday and the day before. But look what happens when you have a constant emissions of methane. Let's say a constant cattle herd in the feedlot. You know, you've always had 10,000 cattle and that has not changed. Then the emissions being constant leads to constant concentrations and constant warming. No additional warming. And remember this, the Paris Climate Accord and all international climate negotiations are around limiting additional warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. All sectors of society are supposed to keep emissions at bay so that the warming does not increase. If we have constant methane emissions, let's say from a constant dairy herd or a constant beef herd, then that leads to no additional warming, but constant warming, no additional warming. So that's, you can see here how these two gases are really different. That's why they shouldn't be just compared like GWP 100 does. But now let's see what happens when you decrease emissions of both CO2 and methane. We start with CO2. So imagine our power plant over the next 10 years or so is ramping down, is going down, and eventually shut down. If you reduce CO2, then you still increase the related warming. Even of decreasing CO2 emissions, you get to increasing warming. Why? Because it's a cumulative gas, and the warming continues up until the point when you shut down that power plant. Once you shut down the power plant, then the warming stops and plateaus. That's what it takes for us to stop additional warming from the fossil fuel sector. We have to go to net zero carbon from the fossil fuel sector if we want to keep warming at bay. For methane, we don't have to do that. We don't have to go to net zero methane, because any kind of reduction of methane will lead to a corresponding reduction of warming. Methane is really an incredible gas. Sometimes people ask me, Frank, is methane a super pollutant? And I will say to them,
in my opinion, CO2 is a super pollutant because, first of all, it has an incredible lifespan of 1,000 years. Once it's out there, it stays there forever. It's a legacy gas. It has an incredible lifespan, but secondly, even if you decrease it, the warming around it increases. And that's just, in my opinion, making that gas a super pollutant. To me, methane is a super opportunity, particularly for agriculture, because when we decrease it, when we decrease methane, then we instantaneously have an impact on warming, namely one where we induce cooling. So now I come to the question that you might have. Is this possible? Can we do this in agriculture? Well, here in California, we have a new law, and it's called SB 1383. It's the methane law. And SB 1383 mandates a 40% reduction, 40% reduction of methane to be achieved by the year 2030. By the year 2030, so in 10 years from now, we have to reduce methane by 40%. At first, when our farmers heard that, they went wild and thought, oh my gosh, just another law. That's all we need. We can never achieve that. Little did they know that the state decided to use a different approach to get us there. Instead of using the cane approach of rules and regulations and fines, California decided to use the carrot approach and incentivize reductions of methane. How did they do that? Through capital cost support, so subsidies. The support was $500 million. So they partnered with the beef industry to implement technologies to reduce methane. And they installed under cap and trade a system where they generated credits that I will talk about in a minute. So since 5 years ago, our dairy industry has strongly reduced its carbon footprint, its climate footprint, I should call it, by 2.2 million metric tons annually. So one of these incentives that the state gave was an incentive to cover the lagoons. So here you see a dairy where normally there is an open lagoon. There's now a cover over that lagoon. So in the past, we called that anaerobic digesters. Now we call this covered lagoons, but it is an anaerobic digester process. You cover the lagoon and you generate totally oxygen-deprived conditions, so-called anaerobic conditions. The microbes in that lagoon water will now generate a lot of methane. The gas that you see bulging out here is called biogas. Okay, about 60% of that, 60 of that biogas is methane. So that gas mix that normally would go into the air is now trapped on the top. And then they go ahead and they clean up that gas and make it into a fuel type for vehicles. This fuel type is called RNG, renewable natural gas. And this renewable natural gas is then sold off to be used by semi-trucks and so on, which now, instead of burning diesel, will burn this much cleaner renewable natural gas. This conversion of biogas using these covered lagoons, this conversion of biogas to fuel is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is, the most carbon negative. And that's a good thing, because what that means is the carbon intensity is very low, okay? It's very low. And as a result, the state has generated generated a crediting system called low carbon fuel standard credits. Low carbon fuel standard credits. And these credits are so high, $200 per ton of CO2e. They are so high that after a few years of installing something like this, you break even. And then you make a lot of money with these credits. These credits are guaranteed for at least 10 years. And our dairy industry is flocking on around this technology and putting it in large scale. The large dairies, most large dairies, I would say, already have deployed this technology. I know of about 150 dairies that is currently doing this. And we have about 2,000 dairies in the state. In my opinion, all large and medium-sized dairies will have this technology in place within the next 5 to 10 years. That's my prediction. Okay. So far, as I said, there are about 150 either built or under construction. And as a result of this, We have already achieved here in California a 25% reduction of methane. The goal was to achieve 40% by 2030. We are already at 25% today. 25%, that is enormous, okay? That is enormous. And now I take you back just to rekindle your memory here. When we reduce methane by a lot, then we generate negative warming, and that's cooling, okay? So we're already doing that. We're not quite at 35% or 40%, but we are well on our way there. And here's what happens. When you reduce methane, you induce cooling, okay? You induce what's called negative warming. And that reduction of the climate impacts through methane is counteracting other greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide and CO2. And when you balance everything out, then you get to a point by which our dairy industry will be at a point of climate neutrality, meaning at a point where the sector will no longer affect the climate in a negative way, driving temperatures up. So that's why I called my presentation Rethinking Methane, Dairy's Path to Climate Neutrality. So I think that's the path we're on, and that's a path I will recommend to everyone. This is not just a question, by the way, of deploying anaerobic digesters. You can reduce methane also by other means. For example, we have looked into feed additives. We have tested around 100 over the last few years. And of these 100, about 95 didn't work, but 5 did work. And they reduced methane by anywhere between 10 to 50%. And these things will be on the shelves within the next 5 years. And what I find exciting is that there are large companies such as Nestle or Starbucks and others who are now actively either doing it already or planning to, buying feed additives that have shown to reduce methane for the farmers that are in their supply chains, because they want the dairy to have a lower carbon footprint, a lower climate footprint, so that their own company's footprint reduces as well. So with that, there are also other techniques, technologies, other approaches, but it's first and foremost really important that we understand the picture around methane accurately. We don't want to increase that gas. We want to keep it stable or decrease it, because when we decrease it, beautiful things happen. If any or much of what I just told you poked your interest, you find way more on my center's webpage. I also write a blog. Here you see the address for the blog. The web address for the CLEAR Center is clear.ucdavis.edu. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have quite a few questions that came in. The first one is, could we consider methane as probably the cheapest green energy?
The cheapest green energy. I don't know if it's the cheapest green energy, but what makes it so beautiful, in my opinion, is that we can take something that was a liability before and we can make it into an asset. Because without the use of these technologies, that gas would just go into the atmosphere and cause trouble. But if we contain it and convert it to fuel, then we can replace fossil fuels, and that's just wonderful. I mean, we are one of 2 industries throughout the entire society that has the ability to do such a thing, and that is just that's just awesome. I don't know if it's the cheapest, but it's one that makes a lot of sense.
Has net global methane emissions from animals, either wild or livestock, increased in the last 100 years? And how do we estimate emissions from wild ruminants?
Yes, it has increased in parts of the world. In other parts of the world, it has decreased. It's all around efficiency, actually. Where efficiencies are improving over time, we see a reduction. So, for example, in the United States, we used to have 25 million dairy cows back in 1950, 25 million. Today we have 9 million. But with these 9 million today, with a much smaller herd, we are producing 60% more milk. It means the carbon footprint of a glass of milk here in the United States has shrunk by 2/3. Now your question on wild ruminants. You know, in the time before the Europeans came to the United States, so let's say 1850 or so, there used to be approximately 60 million bison in the United States and around 40 million antelope. So about approximately 100 million large ruminants. Today we have 90 million beef, 90 million beef and 9 million dairy cows. So again, approximately 100 million large ruminants. So with respect to methane, not much has changed with respect to enteric methane gas from ruminants in this country, and the same is true for your country, for Canada. So that's the answer to that. I see there a question on how has the reduction of methane been measured. It's actually easy to measure that because the lagoons, the covered lagoons, they are metered. Okay, the biogas is metered and sold to be made into RNG. And so all of that is metered and certified by the state of California. So this is not some estimate or so, this is a measurement.
So there's a question here about traditional digesters being very cost prohibitive, and how expensive are the lagoon covers?
They are significantly cheaper because you don't have to build a hard shell. You pretty much use a lagoon and cover it with tarp. It's still expensive. It's still in the millions, but because of these credits that are new, the farmers and the developers break even after a surprisingly short period of time. Again, $200 per ton of CO2e. When you do the math, it's an incredible amount of money that farmers rake in because of that. That is the most carbon negative fuel type there is, and it's compensated as such.
And so is that, sorry, go ahead.
So the traditional digesters were very different, okay? The traditional digesters had all different kinds of technical issues, and the farmers that used them produced power and used that power on their premises. But it doesn't make sense because that power generated very low income streams, and fossil fuel power was just cheaper than that power. So it didn't make economic sense. But with these low carbon fuel standard credits, that makes sense. If you were in the United States, outside of California, you could sell into the California market. If you are a Michigan dairy farmer, you can do what I just said and sell your credits to the California market and get reimbursed like a California dairyman.
All right, so the next question I think we should look at is, do you think that that's the most effective way to reduce fossil fuels in the dairy industry, or is there a different way?
Is what I just said with the digesters the most, yeah, I mean, you can really replace fossil fuels that way. That is the best way. Yeah, that's the easiest and best way. I mean, there are also some other approaches like dairies deploying solar panels and so forth, but and that's not bad either. But I think the state is really behind incentivizing the technology I just described, and so it makes economic sense.
So there are some questions here about how they hold up in the winter, the lagoon covers holding up in the winter and high winds.
Yeah, so we don't really have a winter here, okay? We're in California, we don't have a winter here. I mean, it might be close to freezing sometimes, but it's not really cold. So in Canada, the situation would be different. In parts of Canada, the situation would be different. That does not mean that you can't have anaerobic digesters. You just have to have something that is heated, probably. And that's possible. You can do that. You can build a digester, use part of the gas to produce heat and produce a lot of gas. You can even use co-digestion, which means in addition to the manure that you're digesting, you can use fats, oils, greases, and so on to add energy value and produce more methane gas. And then comes the most important part. Don't just burn it and make power. Never flare it, okay? That would be crazy, but make it into fuel and sell it into the market and get credits. That's the route to go.
So how can we in the industry increase the dissemination of our knowledge about methane to the public to better counter the narrative from those in other areas who want to eliminate cattle?
That's a very good question. So I was as tired as you are, I assume, about all this misinformation and propaganda out there. Many farmers are just frustrated and stick their heads in the sand, or shake their heads and saying this is all ridiculous and I'm not part of this. Plus, I'm not media trained. I don't want to talk to them. And I think that's a mistake. I think all of you can share the narrative that I just presented. I told you this video at the beginning, Rethinking Methane. Share something like this. Be on social media, be on Twitter, for example. Even if you don't want to write on Twitter, you can share stuff that I write with your networks. You can build a network. We need this avalanching effect that our critics use so eloquently. Okay, those activists out there, they are masterful in how they use social media, and we are terrible at that. So I really encourage you to do what you can to help us spread the news. This is not some greenwashing or creative accounting. This is science. Okay, we have to break that science down into a way the public can understand and then share it aggressively, not just with the public at large, but also in particular with policymakers. Get people like myself in front of your Congress, in front of your Senate. Make sure that policymakers understand that if they just, let's say, get rid of half of a country's cows, and they are proposing that in parts of the world, then they need to understand that if they were to make such a move, some other country would just pick up that production and satisfy it. Because the demand for these products is there. And if your country doesn't produce it, somebody else will produce it. And that somebody else who produces it is likely to be less efficient in producing it and producing the same or more emissions. Okay, so shutting down an industry or part of an industry makes no sense. A process called leakage. Okay, so educate yourself, read things like my Clear Center blogs, share them, be on social media. I know it takes some time, but this is your legacy. Okay, we're talking about your legacy. This is not my legacy. That's your legacy we're talking about. And you have to do something for that.
That's great. I think that's a really great way to end our talk today. We do have a couple more questions. And what I think I'll do is I'll pass these off to you to maybe answer individually, if that's all right with you.
Of course.
And if anyone is interested in a copy of the presentation, we'll ask if you could pass that on to us and we'll share that with everyone. So we welcome you to join us next time for our next webinar. And you can visit our new website, VES-Artex.com, to learn more about that. So thank you very much, Dr. Mitloehner. We really appreciate you coming out, and we hope you have a wonderful day, everyone.
You're most welcome. Thanks for having me.